Ma'am, I need you to step back unless you want to file a formal complaint with the Department of Homeland Security, Agent Tran said coolly, holding her badge just low enough for the flashlight glare to reflect off the federal seal. Karen's eyes flicked between the ID and the half-dozen other guests now standing calmly behind her, badges in hand, faces unreadable. The HOA president had marched onto my property to shut down my party because it was 3 minutes past 8 p.m. What she didn't know, what she absolutely wasn't ready for, was that every single guest in my backyard worked in federal law enforcement. In fact, 2 of them outranked the city's police chief. And now she'd walked into a hornet's nest with a clipboard and a superiority complex. That night had started out simple enough. I'd invited a few close friends to celebrate my promotion. After years of working quietly in federal logistics, I had finally been assigned to a new multi-agency task force that dealt with interdepartmental security protocols. It wasn't flashy, but it meant a huge raise and a few new benefits, like finally getting off the road and setting route. I'd bought a nice house in a quiet HOA-controlled neighborhood. A little too quiet, maybe, but I figured I could live with it. For the most part, I did. Until Karen Caldwell, self-appointed dictator of the Oak Haven HOA, had a problem with anything that smelled like fun, freedom, or non-compliance. Her rules were endless, arbitrary, and changed depending on who she liked and who she didn't. She had sent me 4 emails within my first month of moving in, citing offenses like parked vehicle too straight and lawn lighting intensity inconsistent with community warmth values. But tonight she crossed a new line. She tried to eject my guests from my private property because a last-minute HOA ordinance she pushed through claimed all non-resident visitors must leave by 8 p.m. for noise abatement reasons. It wasn't legal. It wasn't voted on. It was a power grab wrapped in legal-sounding nonsense. I had received the email just 4 hours before the party. The language was vague, and it lacked the required board vote and posted notice. Still, I didn't respond. I knew exactly what Karen was trying to do, flex muscle and see if I'd cave. I didn't. I grilled steaks, put out drinks, and waited to see if she'd actually show up. She did. Right on schedule. At 8:03 p.m., she came marching across my lawn like she was personally delivering a ceasefire treaty. 2 board members followed, both looking like they regretted it halfway through my gate. "Your guests need to leave immediately," Karen had announced, waving a laminated paper like it was a court order. "You are in violation of the HOA's new evening occupancy policy. Failure to comply will result in citations, fines, and possibly board review for termination of community status." Before I could even speak, Agent Diego Ramos, my best friend and an FBI field liaison, stepped forward with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll need you to put that in writing and cite the section code," he said casually. "Unless this is just intimidation. Because if that's the case, I'm pretty sure we're legally obligated to report that under federal harassment statutes." Karen's expression twisted. "Who are you?" Another voice chimed in behind her. "That's Agent Ramos, ma'am. And I'm Agent Tran, DHS. That's Agent Patel from the DA, and you've already seen Agent Brody from the ATF earlier when you glared at him for stepping on your grass." Leah Tran's tone was like glass. Calm, clear, and cutting. Karen blinked like a deer in headlights. Then she laughed, assuming it was a joke. "Oh please," she scoffed. "What is this, a costume party? You people think fake badges will scare me?" 3 of them produced real identification. Government issued. Holograms and all. Karen's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "This neighborhood," she hissed, regaining her voice, "has rules. I don't care what agency you claim to work for. No guests after 8 p.m. That's final." I finally spoke. "Karen, that document you sent? It's not legally enforceable. There was no vote, no posting period, and you're citing a noise ordinance that doesn't exist in the municipal code." I checked. Twice. With the city attorney. Oh, and Karen, 3 of these people have worked cases that intersect with national security. You're standing on shaky ground. She tried to brush past Diego, probably to issue her ridiculous citation directly to me. That's when Leah stepped forward with her badge. Ma'am, I need you to step back unless you want to file a formal complaint with the Department of Homeland Security. Karen paused. Her entire face twitched. I saw her calculating. She was used to intimidating civilians, not professionals who had protocols, authority, and the law on their side. But to my astonishment, instead of backing down, she doubled down. I'm calling the police, she snapped. This is trespassing. This is impersonation. You think you can scare me with Halloween badges and fancy talk? This is my neighborhood. I make the rules. You might want to remember those words, Diego murmured. The local police arrived 15 minutes later. 2 officers I recognized. They'd both attended a training seminar last year led by none other than Agent Brody. As they stepped into the backyard and assessed the situation, I watched the realization dawn on their faces. Karen didn't get what she wanted. She got an informal lesson in federal hierarchy. The senior officer turned to Karen and said, "Ma'am, there is no violation here. This gathering is peaceful, on private property, and no laws have been broken." Karen turned crimson. "But the HOA says." "I'm not here to enforce HOA regulations," the officer said, clearly suppressing a smirk. "And from the looks of it, you're outnumbered in terms of authority tonight. Maybe go home." She walked off, still shouting something about board escalation and HOA superiority. But the damage was done. Not to us, to her. She didn't just pick the wrong house to harass. She picked the exact address that could, quite literally, ruin her life if we felt like filing charges. But we didn't. Not yet. Instead, we returned to the party. Drinks were refreshed. Someone turned the music back on. Diego raised his glass and said, "To HOA regulations, may they always be as empty as Karen's threats." I didn't know it then, but that night wasn't the end of it. It was just the opening shot. Karen had tried to flex her petty authority and ran headfirst into a federal brick wall. And as I'd soon find out, her retaliation would cross lines even she couldn't erase. The next morning started quiet, deceptively so. The birds chirped, the breeze rattled the wind chimes on the back porch, and my coffee steamed peacefully in my hand. But something felt off. I hadn't heard the usual neighborhood sounds. No kids playing, no dog walkers chatting, just a weird, artificial stillness, like the calm before a storm. Then I opened my mailbox. Inside were 3 envelopes from the HOA, each one more ridiculous than the last. The first claimed I had violated the evening occupancy restriction by having more than 4 guests past 8 p.m. The second accused me of hostile noncompliance toward board members during active inspection. And the third, the cherry on top, demanded an immediate fine of $1,000 for refusal to vacate during conditional emergency order. Karen had gone full fantasy dictator overnight. I stared at the papers and couldn't help but laugh. She was serious. She was actually trying to financially punish me for not bending to her imaginary authority in front of a yard full of federal agents. I texted Diego and Leah photos of the letters, just to see their reactions. Diego called immediately, half laughing, half cursing, saying he'd never seen a civilian dig her own legal grave so enthusiastically. Leah texted back a simple message: "She's escalating. Document everything." By noon, the escalation had turned public. Karen had called for an emergency HOA meeting at the community center that evening. According to the flyer taped to every mailbox, the meeting would address ongoing security concerns, rule violations, and resident destabilization efforts. I knew that code. She was coming after me officially, and she wanted to rally the bored, retired, and misinformed residents into her personal army of HOA vigilantes. She was going to try and turn my backyard party into a neighborhood scandal. What she didn't realize was that I'd already been one step ahead. I'd forwarded copies of her letters to my agency's legal liaison and asked for an informal review. While I didn't want to make a federal issue out of neighborhood drama, the moment she started threatening me with fake emergency orders and harassing federal officers under color of local policy, she entered dangerous territory. Leah confirmed that DHS had already opened an internal file in case things got out of hand. I didn't intend to use it unless forced, but it was good to know we were covered. That evening, I decided to attend the meeting. I wanted to hear what she had to say in public. The room was packed when I walked in. Karen was at the front, standing next to a projector screen with a smug expression, wearing a blazer like she was hosting a Senate hearing. Her sidekicks, Marcia and Glenn, flanked her like loyal soldiers. The moment she saw me, her mouth curled into that rehearsed smile of false politeness. She didn't acknowledge me directly but launched into a speech about how our community was under threat from rule breakers who thought they were above collective living standards. She clicked a remote and projected photos of my backyard, taken from behind hedges. It was a clear invasion of privacy. There were photos of my guests, close-up shots, even a license plate or two, clearly obtained without consent. She spoke in vague but dramatic terms, referencing potential impersonators, noise-related trauma to elderly residents, and the threat of organized resistance against HOA governance. I sat calmly, arms folded, watching the faces around the room. Some were confused. Others were clearly uncomfortable. And a few were eating up every word. Then she made her mistake. She held up a manila folder and said, "In here is a proposal for a new rule. Any household receiving 3 or more violations in a 30-day window will be banned from hosting gatherings of more than 3 guests after sunset. This will help protect our peace, maintain discipline, and ensure we don't attract negative attention." A few people actually clapped, but several others whispered to each other, clearly questioning her tactic. One elderly gentleman raised his hand and asked if this rule had gone through a vote. Karen said it would be voted on tonight by the board. Another neighbor asked if she had legal counsel review the privacy implications of photographing residents' guests without consent. She dismissed him with a wave. And that's when I stood up. "Karen," I said clearly, "how many violations has your board issued in the past 90 days? She blinked. "That's not relevant to." "It is. Because those citations you delivered to me are being reviewed by federal counsel. And the guests you targeted are federal officers. You may have thought you were protecting this neighborhood, but what you did was interfere with protected personnel on private property. That's a serious issue." A few people gasped. Karen went pale. "And just so you know," I continued, "the Department of Housing and Urban Development has already been notified. Your new rules haven't been reviewed, approved, or registered at the county level. Which means you're issuing unlawful threats, Karen. This whole meeting, this whole circus? It's evidence." She tried to respond, but her voice cracked. "You're trying to intimidate the board." "I don't need to intimidate anyone. I just want you to follow the law. You came onto my property. You harassed my guests. You took surveillance photos without permission. That's not leadership. That's misconduct." I walked out, leaving her standing there in silence. On my way home, 2 neighbors caught up to me and apologized for clapping. One even said, "I didn't realize how crazy she's gotten." I told them it wasn't personal and that I wasn't trying to stir trouble. But if Karen thought she could rule through threats and fines, she was in for a very different kind of reality. That night, I received 2 more letters. One was a fine for verbal disruption of HOA proceedings. The second was a threat to begin the eviction review process. It was laughable, illegal, but it was also a signal. Karen wasn't done. She was doubling down. And that meant I had to prepare for what came next. I didn't want to play legal hardball, but I wasn't going to roll over either. By the time morning came, I had already forwarded the entire meeting recording to Diego, who shared it with the agency's legal team. Leah sent me a single text: "Time to flip the script." I didn't know exactly what she meant. But I was about to find out. Because Karen had declared war. And now the feds were watching. By the next morning, everything had changed. I woke up to the sound of construction tools buzzing outside my house. When I pulled open the curtains, I saw a man in a fluorescent vest hammering something into the ground right by my driveway. I walked outside in my slippers and called out to him. He didn't respond until I was practically standing over him. He pointed to a small printed sign that read, in bold block letters, HOA Notice, Unauthorized Gathering Zone. Under monitored review. It wasn't just ridiculous, it was threatening. They were now publicly labeling my property as a problem area. I took a photo, smiled at the guy politely, and told him he'd need to remove the sign unless he wanted to speak with DHS Internal Affairs. He packed up and left within 3 minutes. I was no longer amused by Karen's antics. At this point, it was targeted harassment, and she wasn't even being subtle. But what she didn't understand was that I wasn't the one feeling the pressure anymore, she was. What Karen didn't know was that the DHS had already opened an incident file. The DEA was cross-referencing her name through its internal complaint system due to the harassment of Agent Patel, and the Office of Fair Housing had begun monitoring the HOA's enforcement history after the rule change was flagged for review. Quietly, methodically, the agencies she tried to challenge were now circling. I hadn't even needed to push. I just sat still and let her dig deeper. Later that afternoon, Leah and Diego stopped by for a quick coffee. We didn't talk about the HOA directly, but Diego did bring up the fact that several other homeowners in the area had previously filed minor complaints about Karen but never followed through because they were afraid of retaliation. Leah suggested that we start collecting those stories in one place, not to attack Karen, but to build a pattern that could be legally reviewed. She offered to set up a secure email for residents to submit their experiences anonymously. We all knew Karen wouldn't take it well if she ever found out. But the tide was turning, and it was time people stopped being afraid of her clipboard army. That night, I got another letter from the HOA. This time it was almost laughable. It claimed that suspicious surveillance activity had been reported in my backyard and that I had refused HOA inspection requests. I nearly choked on my drink. Surveillance? From who? The only camera that had been installed in my yard was a motion-activated wildlife cam, something I'd had for months because of raccoons tipping over the trash. But something about the wording bothered me. It sounded like they weren't guessing. It sounded like they knew about the camera and were trying to spin the narrative. The next day, I checked the footage. That's when I saw it. At around midnight, a figure slipped through the hedge bordering my yard and knelt down near my fence. The grainy image wasn't perfect, but I recognized the cheap khaki HOA-issued vest. The person had tried to stay in the shadows, but the motion sensor caught them fumbling with something metallic. Looked like they were trying to install a second camera facing my porch. I froze the frame and zoomed in. The timestamp was clear. I saved the footage and sent it to Leah immediately. Her response was swift and simple. She forwarded it to DHS Internal Review with a note that read, "Unauthorized surveillance attempt on federal property. Review pending." Within hours, I received confirmation that a formal inquiry had been initiated. That changed everything. What Karen didn't realize was that once federal surveillance laws were potentially violated, even in a civilian setting, multiple agencies could get involved. The legal framework was murky in cases involving HOA overreach, but the moment she stepped into federal territory, she crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Karen, of course, had no idea how deep she was in. That very evening, she hosted a private HOA board meeting without announcing it to the community. But one of the board members, a quiet woman named Sheila, who always seemed unsure of Karen's antics, decided she'd had enough. She left the meeting early and knocked on my door. She handed me a folder filled with internal HOA documents that hadn't been released to residents. In it were drafts of new rules Karen was planning to vote into existence without public discussion. There was also a proposed motion to install hidden sound meters in common areas and give Karen unilateral power to issue citations without board approval. Sheila whispered, "She's trying to turn the HOA into her personal police force. I can't watch her do it anymore." I thanked Sheila and promised her anonymity. Then I called Diego and showed him the documents. His reaction was immediate. He made a few calls to friends in the Department of Housing and Urban Development. 2 hours later, I received a quiet text from an unknown number. "Expect compliance audit. Be ready." That was all it said, but it was more than enough. A HUD audit wasn't some slap on the wrist. It meant every financial move, every fine, every citation Karen had signed off on would now be under the microscope. The following morning, 3 black SUVs rolled into the HOA office parking lot. Karen was inside at the time. From my window, I saw her come out with her usual self-righteous swagger, until the agents stepped forward with federal badges and handed her a notice of audit. Her face drained of color so quickly I thought she might faint. I didn't even have to leave my porch. I just sipped my coffee and watched the queen of HOA chaos realize she was no longer in control. Later that afternoon, I received a formal notice from HUD stating that the HOA was under temporary review and that all fines and citations issued in the last 90 days were suspended pending investigation. Karen had officially lost her grip. And yet, I knew this wasn't the end. People like her don't go down quietly. They scratch and claw and scheme even harder when the walls start closing in. Sure enough, at exactly 11:47 that night, my doorbell camera pinged. Karen herself, wearing a hoodie and holding what looked like a screwdriver, was standing at the edge of my driveway, staring directly into the lens. She didn't do anything, just stood there for about a minute and then disappeared into the darkness. I reviewed the footage 3 times. She was rattled, desperate, and probably thinking she still had one more move left to play. But what she didn't know was that everything she did from now on would be watched, logged, and sent straight to the same agencies she tried to challenge. Karen had spent years weaponizing the HOA against honest homeowners. Now she had triggered something much bigger than she could understand. And she wasn't going to like what came next. By the time the HUD audit team had settled into the HOA office for their investigation, the neighborhood had completely shifted. Where people once turned a blind eye to Karen's antics out of convenience or fear, now whispers filled the sidewalks, and neighbors who had never spoken to me before began nodding or waving with cautious respect. Something about seeing 3 black government vehicles parked outside the once invincible HOA headquarters had unlocked their collective courage. Karen had built her kingdom on paper threats and community compliance, but now the paper had caught fire, and no one was rushing to put it out. Over the next 2 days, the auditors combed through every ledger, every email record, every signed notice of violation issued over the last year. I didn't even need to be involved in the process. That was the best part. All I had to do was sit back and let the professionals do their job. From what I was hearing secondhand, it didn't take long before discrepancies started popping up. Missing expense justifications, private contractor payments that didn't line up, security hires with no licensing, and most importantly, unauthorized fines collected and routed through a private account. That last one alone was enough to trigger a financial fraud alert. Karen hadn't just weaponized the HOA rules, she'd profited from them. Meanwhile, Diego and Leah had continued gathering resident stories quietly. Sheila, the board member who had slipped me those internal documents, had now shared even more. Turns out, Karen had personally overridden several appeal requests from residents who had challenged citations. She'd done so without ever holding proper votes, and in many cases, she hadn't even informed the board. What she wrote on paper didn't match what was happening behind closed doors. She was operating like a monarch, and now the entire house of cards was collapsing in real time. On the 3rd day of the audit, something unexpected happened. One of the auditors, a quiet woman named Janelle, knocked on my door. She said she had a few follow-up questions about the surveillance incident I had reported earlier. I showed her the footage again, along with the timestamp and the enhanced images that Diego had cleaned up using a software tool from his bureau. Janelle didn't say much, but I could tell she was concerned. She asked if I had received any further letters or threats since the audit began. I showed her the one I had gotten just the day before. It was unsigned but clearly printed on HOA letterhead, accusing me of collaborating with outside forces to undermine local governance. Janelle took a photo of the letter and left, expression unreadable. But I knew what that visit meant. It meant things had escalated again, just not in my direction. That night, the neighborhood email list exploded. Someone, no one knew who, leaked a copy of a preliminary audit summary. It listed dozens of violations, including gross mismanagement of funds, illegal surveillance recommendations, and attempts to unilaterally change voting procedures. It wasn't an official report, but it was more than enough. By sunrise, half the neighborhood had pulled their lawn signs endorsing Karen for re-election, and several board members submitted resignation letters. The entire foundation of her control was fracturing beneath her feet. She'd always relied on a mix of fear and confusion to keep people compliant. But now the fear was gone, and the confusion was turning into anger. I heard that Karen tried to push back by filing a complaint of her own, to the county, to the state licensing board, and even a bizarre letter to the FBI claiming she was the victim of an orchestrated intimidation operation. She claimed I was leading a harassment campaign against her and using my connections to fabricate federal interest in the HOA. Unfortunately for her, every agency she contacted already had the actual documentation. Her complaints were dismissed within hours. One agency even responded with a request for a formal statement regarding her conduct, turning her move into yet another backfire. Still, Karen didn't go down easily. The next day, she called for a community emergency safety briefing at the clubhouse. I knew better than to attend. So did most of the neighborhood. But a few curious residents went and recorded it. The footage was like watching someone unravel in real time. Karen, pacing in front of a slideshow that was just blank white slides, warned the handful of attendees that external elements were invading their peaceful neighborhood and that she needed temporary emergency authority to issue citations without delay. She spoke in spirals, sometimes contradicting herself mid-sentence. One resident asked, "Who gave you the right to declare emergencies?" Karen snapped back, "I earned it by protecting this community for 10 years. The footage went viral locally. That night, someone posted it with the caption, "Karen tries to declare martial law in suburbia." I laughed harder than I had in weeks. What Karen didn't realize was that her paranoia was now giving federal investigators even more to work with. Her meltdown had cemented her behavior as unstable and potentially dangerous. And in case she thought that would go unnoticed, she got a personal reminder the next morning when she returned to the HOA office and found the locks changed. A temporary oversight manager had been appointed by the county, pending the results of the federal review. Karen wasn't just suspended, she was removed entirely from access. She stood outside the door for 20 minutes, yelling through the glass, until someone finally called the police. It was poetic in a tragic sort of way. But even as the dust started to settle, I knew it wasn't completely over. Karen still had a key to something. Her access to resident records. Her knowledge of people's weaknesses. And more than anything, her spite. I didn't trust that she'd disappear quietly. And I was right. That evening, as I returned from picking up groceries, I found my backyard gate hanging off its hinges. Someone had forced it open. Nothing was stolen, but the wildlife camera was gone. That same camera that had captured the first surveillance attempt. Luckily, Diego had already backed up the footage. But this confirmed what I feared. Karen wasn't done. Not yet. I filed a police report and sent the details to the audit team. The next day, I received word that Karen's name had been added to a formal investigation list for possible evidence tampering and harassment of a federal witness. She wasn't just a disgraced HOA president anymore, She was a subject of an active case. And as I sat on my porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something satisfying. Karen had tried to create a neighborhood that bent to her will. Instead, she turned it into a place where her actions could no longer hide behind rules and technicalities. She wanted power. What she got was exposure. And soon, she'd get something even better. Accountability. The final blow didn't come from a courtroom, a government office, or a dramatic arrest. It came quietly, during a neighborhood barbecue I hosted 2 weeks after the audit team wrapped up their investigation. The weather was perfect, the food was great, and for once, everyone in the neighborhood looked relaxed. Laughter replaced whispers, and for the first time since I moved in, people weren't watching their words in fear of being reported. It felt like the neighborhood had finally started healing, shedding the shadow Karen had cast over it for years. And while the music played and the kids played tag on the grass, something poetic happened. A patrol car rolled up slowly to the curb, and out stepped 2 plainclothes investigators. They weren't there for me. They walked right past the party and down the street, disappearing toward Karen's house without fanfare or raised voices. A few minutes later, she emerged, flanked by the 2 officers, face pale and posture stiff. No cuff. No shouting. Just quiet questioning and a politely delivered court summons. But everyone saw. And that silence at the party spoke louder than any fireworks could have. That barbecue wasn't just a gathering. It was the punctuation mark at the end of a chapter. People had started talking, openly. Several neighbors came up to me that day to thank me, not because I had won some personal war with Karen, but because I had shown them it was possible to stand up to her. One couple admitted they had been fined over $4,000 across the last 2 years for vague offenses like improper mulch shade and suspicious overnight illumination. They'd been too scared to appeal. Another elderly resident told me Karen had threatened to report his daughter's car for suspicious activity because she visited late at night to help him with medication. These weren't HOA rules being enforced. They were control tactics. And now that grip was gone. Karen's court appearance wasn't publicized, but word got around fast. She was being charged with unauthorized surveillance, mail tampering, and obstruction tied to the HOA financial review. The wildlife cam incident had become part of a broader investigation into evidence manipulation. Turns out, she hadn't just removed the camera, she had smashed it and tossed it into a community trash compactor. Unfortunately for her, the compactor had been emptied the next morning and its contents rerouted to the county waste facility, where a small piece of the broken casing with a serial number had been recovered. Diego called it the dumbest smoking gun he'd ever seen. To me, it was just the final confirmation that she couldn't help herself. Even when backed into a corner, she still thought she could claw her way out through petty sabotage. By the following week, the county HOA oversight panel had finished their formal recommendations. Karen was officially banned from holding any leadership role in any registered HOA for the next 10 years. The Oak Haven HOA board was temporarily disbanded and placed under third-party administration. Fines that had been issued improperly during Karen's term were now being refunded, and homeowners were encouraged to submit records for reimbursement. I received a check in the mail a few days later for every cent Karen had tried to squeeze out of me since moving in. Along with it was a brief letter apologizing for the inconvenience. I didn't care about the money. I cared about what it symbolized. For once, someone like Karen didn't just get away with it. She got caught, exposed, and finally stripped of her power. Despite everything, I never saw her try to confront me again. Not once. I think even Karen knew the difference between revenge and reality by then. She had been the queen of a paper castle, and when the wind blew just right, it all crumbled without a single stone thrown in return. But that didn't mean I forgot what she had done or how close things had come to getting truly dangerous. She had underestimated not just who I was, but who I knew. And she had treated my guests like intruders, not realizing they were the very people who enforced the laws she thought she could manipulate. That first night, when she marched across my lawn waving her laminated nonsense and barking orders, she believed she was untouchable. She believed her clipboard could outrank a federal badge. And that belief led her straight into her downfall. A week later, I hosted one last event. Not a party, not a loud gathering, just a quiet dinner. I invited a few close friends. Diego, Leah, Patel, even Sheila from the former board, and a few neighbors who had shown the courage to speak out. We sat under the string lights in the backyard, surrounded by calm. The energy was different now. There was no tension, no fear of flashlights sweeping across the fence line. Just peace. And as we passed food around and shared stories, Diego raised his glass and said, "To HOA overreach, may it always underestimate the federal guest list." Everyone laughed. And I knew right then that this was more than just the end of Karen's reign. It was the beginning of a new chapter for the community. People were talking about forming a new board, one focused on real issues like security lighting and road repairs, not the angle of a garden hose or the height of holiday wreath. There was talk of rewriting the bylaws from scratch. With transparency. With fairness. I told them I didn't want to run, but I'd help them draft everything. I wanted to leave it better than I found it. As the evening wrapped up and people began saying their goodbyes, Leah lingered a moment longer. She looked around the yard and said, "This place feels different now." I nodded. It did. Not because Karen was gone, but because people had finally stopped being afraid of her. That was the real victory. Not the fines, not the audit, not even the court summons. It was the way the neighbors now stood a little straighter, looked each other in the eye, and didn't lower their voices out of fear of being reported. That was the thing Karen never understood. Power isn't in the rules you write or the letters you send. It's in the people who choose whether or not to follow you. And now? No one was following her anymore. I walked Leah out to her car, then stood at the curb watching the stars. The porch light glowed softly behind me, and the night was quiet. No shadows creeping around the fence. No cameras hidden in bushes. Just silence. Finally, real silence. And as I turned back toward the house, I smiled. Let Karen tell whatever story she wanted. Let her blame whoever she had to. The truth had already been written. And everyone had read it,